A puppet on stage is in a constant struggle to live, to appear alive. An audience has to see beyond its artifice to accept it as something other than an inanimate object. In everyday life, the rules and life of the puppet are different. Its relationship to its operator and others around it change. I'm Peter Morton, and Life-Size Me was a project in which I took a puppet off the stage and put it in everyday life. So I'm designing the puppet, I'm putting it down on paper basically and putting it in kind of a 2D form. So then I can shape it into its 3D form. I'm using this book on the human form to begin to kind of understand the shapes of its different body parts, its bones, its muscles, and how I'm going to kind of form the elasticity of the muscles and get that a movement that is as natural as possible. The puppet was built as a life-size replica of myself. It took 6 weeks to build and was made up of over 35 components. It was important that it was comfortable to wear, but also retain as much movement as possible. So this is the spinal column of the puppet. I've designed it to be designed like a spine, really, just with less vertebrae. So the head is pivoted here and here, and they kind of pivot in opposite directions. And that allows me to get the kind of range of head movements I'm going to need. There's that moment when you kind of breathe life and the kind of top of the chest shot up, and it suddenly became alive for me, and its joints were moving, and it was just fabulous to see it up and alive and moving around. And we had quite a lot of experimentation with it, just moving, not really in any kind of naturalistic or showing any emotion, but it was fantastic to have that sense of these materials are alive and it's moving how it wants to move. The puppet was introduced into everyday life through it being permanently attached to me for 2 weeks. First of all, the puppet needed a name, and this was significant. I felt like it needed to be humanized, to take on human qualities, and the naming of it seemed to achieve this. It was far easier for me to accept it into my life with a name. It strengthened the bond between the object and the subject. It gave it more of an identity. On the first evening, the puppet and I sat and chose a name, and this was Ridley, which means from a cleared wood. Instinctively, one of the first things Ridley did was explore the natural world, the world in which he was constructed out of. Ridley became the puppet's identity, which I and others around me had created. But Ridley was also the materials, the weight, the physical bulk, the presence, which made living very hard.
I never really came round to Ridley. He was okay. I didn't have any kind of nice feeling towards him. He was making Peter's body hurt. He was making Peter really slow, who made Peter seem really old. So, yeah, he was never my favourite person.
When I'm here at home,
it almost becomes a little bit more, if I were Ridley all the time, it'd be very forced. And if there's no one here, it almost seems like there's no one to perform to, almost, because it still seems, when I've got the head on and the hands, that there's some kind of performance involved.
I would argue that Pete didn't live with Ridley. I think Pete lived with sort of wood on his chest. I never saw Pete animating the puppet, so I never was able to sort of establish it as a sort of character. I saw it more as a burden because I could see how upset Pete got.
I'm doing things through Ridley, which is actually more natural as a whole, because we kind of work together and there's a sense of unity there, because everything kind of flows and changes very well. Although things are difficult, there's a sense of togetherness, which kind of holds in it a very kind of unique feeling.
Ridley discovered the concept of life and death. Behind the glass there were still beings that were once alive. And then you have Ridley, the other side of the glass, something that was never alive but is still moving.
It's been interesting just to kind of look at almost the bigger picture in terms of Ridley discovering it and discovering alive things that are now kind of dead and preserved, and I think questions his existence and what will happen to him afterwards, I suppose, because I'm not entirely sure.
Ridley's life is held within the minds of others and myself. He suggests this through movement. It is his performance of mimicry that people see and relate to. They see their own experience of human emotion within him. However, Ridley wanted to be accepted more than just a mimic or an illusion. Clothes were an important part of this. He chose them and even felt like he had some kind of ownership over them. It significantly changed his physical form by visually making him more human.
I do have an attachment to the puppet. And like, see, I don't feel right calling him the puppet. I want to call him Ridley. It's weird. Like when people say it or the puppet, and I'm like, oh yeah, Ridley. And it seems completely normal for me to just say Ridley.
It's kind of become part of my life almost, and I think it's going to be a very surreal experience just having him off, which it's quite funny, it was a surreal experience having them on at the start. I'm definitely going to miss parts of it, but I'm also not going to miss huge parts of it.
Ridley's life was a paradox. It started with death and ended with death, and everything in between was also. Biologically, he had never existed, but for Ridley, the rules were different. As with other inanimate objects, he existed through myself and other people's perceptions of his physical form. This is where the life of Ridley was held. Oh! Oh! God, that didn't take long.